Okay, 𝗂𝗲𝗀𝗃. And then, so here, setting the cut score is very important to understand the test scores. And then there's some specific procedures you have to follow. And then I was interested about what are the good way to set the cut scores. And that was my another research interest. And then the L2 listening assessment, which I'll talk a little bit more detail today. Particularly, I was interested about two issues in languages listening assessment. The first one is, I think some of you attended the forum conference a couple of days ago, right? Hosted by EIL at 𝗃𝗏 University. The repeated theme that was talked about was about we should not just simply rely on inner circle Englishes as a gold standard, right? Nowadays, English is used as a, what, world Englishes or international languages, not ESL or EFL, right? There are much more English speakers from, I believe you're familiar with the 𝗂𝗁𝗃𝗀𝗃's, like, you know, concentric models of different English varieties. There are much more English speakers from outer circle Englishes and expanding circle Englishes. And then think about, see, I'm Korean and then you're Thai, and we don't use either Korean or Thai. We use English, right? So we use English as a kind of lingua franca. But when you look at the English listening test, all the test listening input is like spoken by British or American, Australian, right? So I said, why not Korean? Why not Thai? Why not Chinese? Why not Indian? So I was thinking about implementing those different variety of Englishes as a legitimate language listening test input. But then there's a lot of pushbacks about that, my recommendation, right? Because why do I hear Indian accented? Why Korean accented Englishes? And then also another big concern of doing that is about possible bias, right? So if you're Thai listeners and taking speaker's voice, you have a benefit over other listeners who do not share Thai as their first language, right? So we want to make sure that we increase the authenticity, representativeness, or our L2 listening input while minimizing those bias issues. So we found that if you control the intelligibility of those accented speakers we use as a listening test input, we could kind of enhance the representative of English varieties while controlling the bias effect. And then last but not least was the pragmatics assessment, which I'll talk really more detail today. We use language for performing some specific functions, right? So you may speak English perfectly fine grammar, good vocabulary, but your language use may not be appropriate for a certain context, right? So it is very important to use language appropriately in a certain context. So that's pretty much about pragmatics assessment. So that's my final research interest in language assessment. And then what we're going to talk about today is about, we briefly talk about the purpose of language use has been changed over time. And then construct language assessment has also changed over time. So we're going to go over this, what changes we seen in the history of language assessment, and then how the different task has been changed. And then I'm not sure if you have enough time. So if you have enough time, I will talk about all issues in English as a specific purposes assessment, ESP assessment as well. And then these all issues kind of related to my current research in language assessment. Okay, so before I jump on to today's topic, I wanted to kind of make sure that you have a still basic understanding of language assessment that I talked about last week. So please go to this website called www.ghostofbox.com. And when you go there, type this access code, this 9-digit access code, 288-693-054. So please go to the GOSO box now and type these 9-digit number, and you will see there's very short 9 multiple choice questions to make sure that you have some basic understanding of a language assessment that I talked about last Sunday. Yeah, for the Zoom participants, I typed the website GOSO box and then the 9-digit number 288-693-054.
น้ำตกที่เราทำเป็นไม้ไผ่ทำมันดูแลยากน้ำตกนี่ดูแลไม่ยากค่ะอายุเซฟนี่ครับประมาณ2 ปีที่ว่าโดนความชื้นแล้วไปตลอดยากใช่ครับมีร่วมมีสุดบ้างเราก็ตัดที่สุดนะจะต้องเปลี่ยนตัวไม้ไผ่2 ปีเห็นนี่ตรงตาเกียง
Okay, so I know not all of you completed this quiz yet, but let's go over item by item, which and then it'll, we could refresh your memory now. Okay, so the first one, first item, CRT test score tend to produce relatively little variance. So a lot of you got this item correct, right? But to answer these questions, you have to know what CRT from in the beginning. What does CRT stand for? Criterion reference testing, right? Okay. Then what is CRT? What criterion reference testing? We interpret the test scores in terms of their scores in relation to external standards. So we concern about how much they know. We're not concerned about their relative standing, which is the purpose of a norm reference testing, right? Okay. And the next issue is that relatively little variance. What does variance mean? Variance. Variance is like just one word. I would say variance is about the amount of difference among the difference among the test scores. That's the variance, amount of difference, right? So if your test takers score very similarly, then their scores we call homogeneous. It's the same. Everybody received like 60 out of 80, right? Then that test score has a very little variance. The amount of difference among the test scores is tiny, right? But if some students got 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, if scores really kind of spread around the possible score range, We say there is a large variance, right? And then the question is, the CRT scores produce relatively little variance. Is this statement true or not? Is true compared to NRT, right? So this, I think, statement is a little bit of a tricky because these days, a lot of norm reference testings claim to be CRT as well. So think about like TOEFL, IBT, IELTS, Pearson English test. There's begin as a norm reference testing. Their purpose is just like spread around the students the overall English language proficiency, so the test scores can be used for admission purposes. But now people want to understand their scores, not just only for their relative standing, but like CFR levels. So their tests can be both NRT and CRT, but these tests kind of produce large variance, right? So, but typically, so this item is like, not good item. So typically CRT test score produce relatively little variance compared to norm reference testing, right? So I would say these items close to true, but sometimes it can be false too. It depends on what type of CRT you refer to. Cohesion refers to the quality of the mental representation of the text based on semantic relationship. So I know there's some low frequency word like semantic relationship, mental representations. Come on, what does it mean? So that's why a lot of people got lost here. Is this true statement? This is actually coherence, right? Coherence is about quality of a mental representation. Oh my goodness, what does that mean? So this is about, simply speaking, the whether the text is making sense to you, right? In the minds of the reader or listener. I think I show you that what is it? Miss South America, the the interview, right? What she was asked about. So a recent poll said that fifth Americans cannot locate the U.S. on the world map. Why do you think that is? That's the question she received, right? And then you have some kind of expected response. That's your mental representation. Okay, 20% American kids cannot find the United States on the world map, which sounds very ridiculous, right? Why? And then you expect a response like, yeah, unfortunately, they're not well educated and they don't know much about the geography, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of your mental representation about the possible answers. But then she talked about South Africa, Iraq, Asia, which is not really relevant to the questions, right? So the quality of the mental representation of text was really, really kind of off. Right? So that's coherence. Cohesion is more about how you combine different sentences together using good cohesive devices and markers, transition markers, right? So uh, I think that this statement itself is quite complicated, but this statement is about coherence, not the cohesion. Okay, this could happen to your language test data too. You have item, right? And you found that a lot of students got this item wrong. There are two possible interpretations. First, your item is faulty. Something wrong with the item. Wrong answer key, ambiguous instructions, right? Or your test takers are hopeless. They didn't study. Oh my God. So let's see what's the really case with this item. Elocutionary force is related to the effect of the utterance of the hearer. This is false. And then what is the correct answer? Elocutionary force is the related effect of utterance of the hearer. And then you may wonder why so many students got this item wrong. I mean, you should blame the instructor, right? He wasn't clear about, explaining the difference between elocutionary force, elocutionary effect. And then the terminology itself is confusing, right? This is like not really transparent. What do you mean by, I mean, you understand force, but what do you mean by elocutionary? Elocutionary, right? It's probably from all the Latin words. Um, so, and then the next questions you might have to answer is it important? Is it important to know the meaning of a elocutionary effect? Yeah, so if you're not really interested in pragmatics, then this concept may not be the important. But, you know, the elocutionary, I mean, another reason why many people got this item wrong, I think we rarely use elocutionary force these days. We instead use speech acts. That's more common, right? So I think you should blame me because this terminology is kind of becoming outdated. So that's why many people got this item wrong. It's my bad. Okay, here. And then the diagnostic test is a test designed to determine degree of learning that had taken place by the end of the course. Hang on. Yeah, so now, yeah, we have some hope here, right? So many people got this item correct. But what is wrong with this item? I mean, if you use diagnostic test at the end of a course, it's too late, right? It's too late. You have to administer diagnose test in the middle of the test. For norm reference testing, you would most interested in students percentile score. So you have to know what percentile mean. That's the ranking, relative ranking. So if someone's a fifth percentile, what does that mean? Fifth percentile. Is it good or bad? High or low? Fifth. Low. Low. It's confusing. You have to be careful, right? I mean, if your parents, if your kids got the mom and dad, I got the second percentile, you shouldn't be happy about it. That means only 2% of students receive same or lower than your kid's score, right? It's not a good. The higher the better. Percentile is higher the better. Yeah. Oh no. Which scale measurement most appropriate for gauging a learner's attitude towards a target language on a Likert scale? I think the answer is ordinal scale. But hang on. Yeah, these items can be faulty again, right? So I think that some of you chose interval too. But then I think that the reason why the answer is ordinal is that the word Likert scale. Yeah. Oh, this Likert scale, you have to also careful with the pronunciation because many people pronounce it as a Likert scale. But Likert scale is like your level of your alcohol level. Like if you say, my Likert scale is 20, oh, you're not that strong. The vodka is like 40. That's the Likert scale, right? You have to pronounce the Likert scale. Because I remember I mispronounced it too. And then that I really cracked many people. Said, oh, my Likert scale. No, you have to say Likert scale. So Likert scale is like range from 1 to 5. That's typical, right? So when you say I use a Likert scale, that means that your scale is ordinal scale, not interval scale. Okay. The limitation of measurement can relate to limited number of the task unit. That's about imprecision. Everybody's all over the place now. Right, because I think that can be related to the incompleteness as well. That because incompleteness is related to the representative of your items and task content, right? But the answer was imprecision. And then the norm group, this one is incompleteness because norm group is, so this is a little kind of a mystery because you want to interpret the test score against the specific group of people, right? But then that specific group of people we call the norm, but norm is not the same as the whole population, right? So that limitation is related to incompleteness because norm cannot be the complete target population of the language testing. I think this is the final item. Which of the following tests use relevant to 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗲 from the Bible? Yeah. Achievement. So I don't, the people who chose the achievement as answer don't know about what shibboleth is, right? You cannot say, hey, you have to protect shibboleth many times. See, you have to pronounce correctly. Then you can see it as an achievement test. But like, the pronunciations, accent is used as a ethnic marker, right? So this test is used for identification purposes. Okay. So yeah, so the result is not really promising. Look at these, all the percentage scores. It's not really, let's see, let's quickly calculate the average of these scores. It's about 46%. It's below 50%. So it's I mean, it could happen to your own classroom too. So then what are you going to do? I think we already talked about this. There are some bad items, right? So I know you are very, smart, hardworking students. So I think the honors should be on me, not you. Okay, so that's like quick diagnostic tests about your overall understanding of language testing. Okay. Okay, so here, let me share the screen to here. Okay, can everybody see the screen? Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so now this is about what are the trends in language assessment or assessment in general too. So in the past, we only concern about summative assessment, right? So we just want to order the students from the lowest to the highest level. And then we often make a high stake decision, admission, exit, right? But nowadays, people more interested about how do we use assessment for and as learning. In other words, formative assessments. So for those who attended the forum conference last week, we had one of a plenary speaker, Lin Chung from City University of Macau. She's quite, done a lot of research publication on this issue, and I think she's most active researcher in terms of washback and formative assessment. And I think she listed the possible formative assessment. What are the key principles? So we know what the key principles of formative assessment, right? We don't really want to just know their percentile scores. We know their overall progress over time. So we use the test scores for observation and provide feedback and their improvement over time. And then like classroom questioning, comment only marking, self-peer assessment, formative use of summative tests, kind of a good example of using formative assessment effectively. But I want to do a little bit more information about dynamic assessment. So have you heard about dynamic assessment? No, never. Okay, so dynamic assessment is different from static assessment, which we are familiar with. Static assessments like, TOEFL, IELTS, TU GET, and, all this standardized language assessment is an example of a static assessment. And your classroom quiz is also static assessment too. And then the quiz we just did is also static assessment too, right? And then static assessment, dynamic assessment is different from many aspects. First of all, in terms of construct, what we are measuring. So static assessment is quite stable. That's the view of construct, right? So like pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary. So we believe that that kind of a language construct, stable, what means doesn't change, right, from time to time. It's stable, well, at least for, at least a month, maybe. Uh, it's changing, even for a short period of time. It's kind of a little difficult to follow, but that's their view of construct. For them, construct is not stable, is a variable, it's changing. It's not fixed, flexible, fluctuating. So in static assessment, the target time is from past to present. So achievement test is kind of good example of target time from past to present, right? So we taught you, right? We taught you, we gave a lot of homework. I did my best to instruct you. So I want to see your achievement, your progress. So our target time is like from the past up to present. But dynamic assessment, interestingly, their target time is not from past to the present, but present to future. Present to future. If you're interested about present to future, who you often go to? Fortune teller. There we go. Fortune teller. Yeah, fortune teller. I stay near the Samyang stations, and then there's a lot of fortune tellers, on the street, right? And then they tell you about your future, right? So it's the same thing. If you're interested about your future in language assessment, no, language ability, language knowledge, take the dynamic assessment, because dynamic assessment is concerned about your potentials, not what you can do, not your current language abilities or knowledge, your potentials, right? You're now at this stage, but I see your future like this, right? And if you want to know future language knowledge abilities, right? Don't go to fortune teller near Sanyang station. Take the dynamic assessment, right? But then you may wonder, hey, is there any theory behind this? Yes, of course. So static assessment, they're pretty strongly rooted in psychometrics, right? Hey, yeah, like, the measurement error should be reduced, right? So then their test scores is truly reflect their underlying hidden language abilities and knowledge, right? That's what, basic of psychometric theory, right? We cannot see, that's like related to indirectness limitation. So we don't see your language ability skill is somewhere in your mind, your brain, right? But it's manifested as your language behavior in terms of pronunciations, vocabulary, grammar, right? So you want to quantify that underlying language ability using some numbers, right? And then your numbers should be good indicator of the underlying language abilities, and it should be stable. If fluctuate, so for example, if you scored 10 out of 10, day one, and you and something wrong with the test. Why is the score fluctuate? We believe that language ability construct is stable, right? So that's kind of a fundamentals, the basic principle of a psychometric theory. But social culture theory has a different view about that. And they believe that language ability is not fixed, is always changing as a function of interaction between uh, language user and mostly like caregivers or parents, teachers, right? So their language ability change, improve as a result of interactions. So that's the view of social culture. Like Vygotsky is a big person on this theory. So their difference is also agents too. Agents. So think about your static assessment, right? When you give a test to students, who's taking the test? Students, right? Teachers do not take a test. They have a good time, right? Proctoring the students, right? Make sure that they're not cheating, right? But in a Dynamic assessment is a different story. They're dual agents, students and teachers together. So they work together. They co-work. They're co-workers in some extent. So teachers not just like monitoring their students, proctoring students, they're actively engaged in the students' test-taking process. And in static assessment, we call this kind of active engagement cheating, right? Hey, just poking, students like, that's not correct answer. If you do that, that's cheating, right? But in dynamic assessment, that's the teacher's main job. So student like struggle on the test, you see, and then like, hey, look at the first paragraph, something like that. That's, they call the assistance or scaffolding. And then there are some different views about context consequently. So static assessment, context should be separable, right? But then dynamic assessment is inseparable. So in static assessment is a context-free, but dynamic assessment is a context-bound. So dynamic test assessment course is a very context-specific, right? So what that means, let's see, you have a conversation with the one person, and then you guys hit it out really well, and there's like conversation go back and forth. But when you talk to another person, right, you don't know what to say. There's an awkward silence, right? And then from the third person's point of view, your like language abilities is changed when you talk to person A versus when you talk to person B, right? And then if you give a different scores, when you talk to student A, person B, that's context-bound scores. So that's the view of a dynamic assessment. So they give you different scores, right? Oh yeah, 10 with the person A, you're 5, person B. And then at the same time, because the responsibility of these language behaviors is shared by those people, they will not give you each separate score, because the social culture people believe that language abilities are co-constructed. That's the key terms too. Co-constructed, it's constructed together. So they do not give a separate score. They give you just like, yeah, it's your score for both people, right? So that's how they view this construct and the test scores. Okay, so to better understand this dynamic assessment, you have to know, it's called the ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development. So we have this like what we call the comfort zone. You could do alone, and the learning zone can do with the help, and then anxiety zone is cannot do with the help. So static assessment is only interested about the comfort zone, what you can do alone, but the dynamic assessment, they focus on the middle zone, the learning zone, what they can do with the help. Anxiety zone is like the areas, items, tasks they cannot do even with the help. So one thing we could learn from this is that students, test takers, has a different level of responsiveness to scaffolding, right? So student A might be able to answer item correctly with just the one simple help, right? Hey, try again, right? But then student B with a little bit more help, like, oh yeah, you like giving the more explanation for some key vocabulary, and then help them to provide some translations, right? If you have to give a little bit more assistance, that give you your understanding of their potentials, right? If you need to more help versus little help, that'll give you about difference in their learning potentials, which is not possible in the static assessment, right? Because we do not provide any assistance. But then I will just skip this one. But the main issue is that, okay, it sounds quite promising, but it's practical. Can you implement this your language classroom? Let's see. Is there anyone who teach like English at school setting, like secondary school, college? Anyone? So 𝗧𝗏𝗃 and 𝗏𝗏, what do you teach too? How many students do you have in your classroom, 𝗧𝗲𝗃? 30. And 𝗃𝗲 what? 1. How many students? You 30? 30, 40, right? So there's so many students. And then do you think you could provide this kind of scaffolding to each student? Come on, of course not. That's not possible. Might I? So then what we can do is here is that what are the kind of realistic way to implement dynamic assessment for such a large classroom? So that people came up with the idea about interventionist DA, dynamic assessment. So what they do is you have to use a computer, right? That the paper-based is not going to work. So you have using this kind of a pre-test treatment and post-test kind of approach. So students like have a, they're administered the items without any help, right? And if they get item wrong, they'll have some pop-up window, like very, very implicit feedback. Try again. Okay, so that kind of hints you that you got the item wrong, right? And then you might try again. If you get this item correct, you move on to the next item, next task, right? And then you got that item wrong again, you got the same implicit feedback, try again. If you got this item wrong again, you get more explicit feedback. Like, hey, look at the first paragraph more carefully. There's where this statement is located. And then say, oh, okay. And then you got the main idea. And then if you got the correct item correct, move on to the next question. That's interventionist DA, right? So we will provide interventions, like standardized intervention across all students. It's also called item by item approach to assessment. But students don't really receive individualized feedback. That's the biggest limitation, right? But interactional DA is like very typical dynamic assessment, which you can use when you have a smaller number of students, like 5 or 5, less than 5, maybe. Then you provide individualized feedback on their performance on the test. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to implement dynamic assessment for large classrooms, use interventionist DA, but then you have to acknowledge that we do not provide individualized feedback. So it's quite difficult to estimate their learning potentials using interventionist DA, right? Because some students might, perform well, explicit feedback right away, not implicit feedback, because each student has a different preference, different level of language abilities. So interventionist DA is not always useful. Okay, and then I'll just move on here. Oh, this is like one thing that I found quite interesting article. I always introduce this article to my students here. So this paper was published in Applied Linguistics 2015. So what they did in this study, they interview non-language testing people across different disciplines. They talk to like medical doctor, engineers, like car mechanics, nurses, health professionals, right? And then they were trying to identify what are some basic common characteristics of diagnostic assessment, right? And then what they found was that these 5 major findings here, the instrument or diagnostic test does not perform the diagnostic, but it is the user of the instrument. So think about when you go to see a doctor's office, right? What they usually do in your office. They ask a question. So, hey, what seems the problem? Are you feeling okay, right? And then they do some quick screening using a stethoscope. And let me hear your heartbeat, and then take a deep breath, right? So here, the instrument they use was stethoscope, right? But that instrument itself does not perform diagnostic. It's the doctor who make decisions whether you have a problems or not. Same thing, language testing, language test itself does not give you any diagnostic informations. The teachers, right, testers, is perform the diagnostic. And then the instruments should be designed in a user-friendly, targeted, discrete, efficient manner in order to assist the teacher. So this is the where that integrated language assessment has a little value here, right? So reading to write, listening to write is an authentic task. But for diagnostic purposes, is it better to use kind of items designed in a discrete manner, right? So you could tell which area that students is lacks or they need to work on more. Point 3, diagnostics should include learner self-assessment. So in language testing, we tend to downplay, ignore self-assessment. Believe that students don't know their abilities. They tend to either underestimate or overestimate their language abilities. But think about in other setting, like when you go to the car mechanic, right? He'll ask you, why are you here? Right? Oh, I think something wrong with my tire, right? It keeps losing the air pressure, right? They'll ask you, self-assess yourself or your machines or your computer, right? So the self-assessment is quite important in diagnostic assessment in other area, but ironically, in language teaching situations, we really disregard self-assessment. So it is really important to let them self-assess their language ability or skills. So I think that point 4 is the most important, right? There are 4 diagnostic stages, and first 2 stages should not be skipped. Listening, observing, initial assessment, use of tools, test, expert help, and decision making. So see that these first 2 steps cannot be skipped, but we often skipped these 2 in our language classroom, right? We don't listen to our students. We don't observe them. We don't provide any initial assessment. We just start from think about your first day in your classroom. What do? You pass out the syllabus, right? And then you just go through syllabus. This is, our course objectives, and this is what we do. This is like how you, grade it. But we don't listen to them, right? We don't observe them. That's the problem. And we don't do any kind of pre-test. That's really uncommon. So if you don't have these first 2 steps, it's quite difficult to diagnose their improvement in language ability or skill. Use of tools, tests, and expert help. So that's what we're actually lacking in the field of language assessment, right? We don't really have a good language diagnostic tools. Think about, it's quite challenging and difficult for language teachers to come up with their own diagnostic language assessment tools. And then you think about, okay, then can we use some commercially available standardized language assessment tools? But they're not really useful for making some diagnostic decisions, right? Decision making. This is also we miss in language assessment, right? Think about in a situation when you see the doctor's office, you have some problems, right? So, doctor, I don't feel well. These days I have some low spirit. I don't know what's happening. I can't sleep at night well. And then doctor might, do some diagnosis with some tools, right? But what do? They said, oh yeah, you have some you have some take a diagnose, right, about your health problems. They say, I think you are the oxygen level is a little low, for example. And then what's your following questions? So, so okay, so what? And then you have to come up with some decisions. So I think that this is kind of specific exercise you have to do. They'll probably give you some medications, right? They make some decisions for you, right? But in language teaching context, we rarely do A and B first step from the first place. But if you do this diagnostic, we rarely make some decisions about them, right? We do not provide any some support courses. We don't do any some kind of a helpful, useful decision for them. So that's what is really lacking. So they recommend that the diagnostic language test should lead to intervention, some specific decisions, right? Yeah. So I think that this article is very insightful. And then if you want to use language assessment for diagnostic purposes, make sure that we follow this 4 diagnostic stages here. Okay, before I move on to the next topic, I received the one question from the Zoom audience here. The question disappeared for some reason. Let's see. Wait a minute. I think the question was about using technology in the dynamic assessment context, right? Oh, there we go. So how possible it is for AI to take the place of teachers in dynamic assessment? Yeah, I want to ask this question to you. What do you think? So we just talked that, teachers themselves is quite difficult to provide individualized, scaffolding feedback to students, right? Especially if you teach a large language classroom. Would AI be the future answer in dynamic assessment context? Any thoughts? Parisawa, do you have any thoughts about that? Have you thought about it? To what extent? Okay. Yeah. So actually, I will show you some real example when I talked about interaction and competence, how technology can help us to assess and teach interaction and competence, and into some other language abilities as well. But for that questions, I think it's a very likely and also very possible. I think AI can not replace, assist language teachers to provide some individualized feedback, scaffolding to students, so we could better estimate their potentials, not what they can do right now, but what they can do in the future. Yes, so I will get into more detail later, but my short answer to the question is possible and very likely, and it also is hopeful, although we have some ethical concerns about that, but which we'll talk about later too. Okay, so what time is it now? So 10:30. Okay, so yeah, we'll just skip that vocabulary part. So I'll just jump on to the interaction of competence now here. So so the new trends in language assessment is that now we want to assess beyond the typical language knowledge and grammar, right? We want to know how well they communicate with each other, right? So we know that speaking is not the same as talking, right? You may find some people who's very good at speaking, but not at talking, right? But in our real life, we do talking more than speaking, right? It's not really common, you speak to persons like in front of the class or, it's very rare, although we do, but we do talking more often than speaking, right? But then the abilities that we need to talk well is beyond grammar and vocabulary and pronunciations, right? So then we needed some kind of the using the Gramsci's term interaction of competence. So what is interaction of competence in the first place? According to Gramsci, 1986, she defined interaction competence as the ability to interact in a purposeful, meaningful way, considering social, cultural, pragmatic dimensions, visual, and even that. So basically, you have to consider these kind of contextual factors like speech, situation, event, and act, and then whether you could, interact purposeful and meaningful way. And then the Galassi and Taylor 2018, they kind of more operationalize for the construct of interactional competence. Sorry, I forgot to share the screen. Okay. So interactional competence entail these aspects: topic management, turn management, interactive listening, breakdown repair, and nonverbal visual behaviors. So yeah. So we the 𝗏𝗀𝗃 defined interaction competence is this one single sentence, but it's still abstract, right? So these scholars and other pragmatics scholars, researchers, operationalize interaction competence, which can be observable using these small as the smaller aspects of interaction competence. So this is a very famous illustrations that these two researchers used to explain these different aspects of interaction competence. So the turn management is a very important in interactional competence, right? So how to start, maintain, ending, pausing is important, right? So whenever think about in a situation when you have a conversations, you don't want to really dominate the whole conversations. I mean, some people do, but and so you know how to start and how to maintain and how to end, how to shift the turns is important. And then topic management, how to initiate, how to extend, how to shifting, how to closing is quite important in conversation, right? Think about when you meet the stranger, not a really true stranger, but like people who just met, like in a conference. You have a certain topic to talk about, right? And then you try to find some commonalities, right? So, oh, where you're from? You just like where you're from, you know, what's your specialty? The reason why you're asking those questions to find the certain topics in common, so you can kind of talk about it, right? So that's quite important skills in interaction. And then non-verbal behavior like eye contacting, facial expressions, laughter, posture, right? So that's also quite important. And then breakdown repair, and when something communication breakdown happens, how you know repair the problems, like how to make a clarification questions to that person's. So that's important skill, interactional competence. And then, but the final one is interactive listening, and back channeling is one of them, right? Just to indicate that you're following that person's, like it could be just simple nodding. It depends on the different language and culture. Um, what about in Thai? How to show your back channeling in Thai? Hmm? Hmm? Like this? Any other like cup like chai, and then you do like that, right? Yeah. So that's kind of back. If you don't do any back channeling, the conversations become very dry, right? Um, what about Korean? Was it? You probably watch a lot of K drama. You probably noticed some typical back channeling. Can you recognize any typical back channeling in Korean? Oh, right. Oh, yeah, that's very authentic. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Wow. And then what else? Like 대박. Have you heard about 대박? Yes. Yeah, 대박. And what else? Yeah, yeah. I live in the United States so long, so I don't really know what the recent back channeling is. But why? Yeah, that's a good one. And then the Japanese, like usually Japanese women is very good at back channeling, right? So, they're like really responsive. So I like talking to Japanese women actually. Yeah. They're really good at the interactive listening. But why do we have to assess this? Not for fun, right? Um, I think the main reason is like, first of all, it depends on the purpose of your assessment. So I don't think I don't have time to talk about ESP today, but in certain ESP assessment context, this interaction and competence are very important. So like if you want to be a medical doctor and your language is not your first language, then you should know how to talk to the patients and how to talk to other health professionals, right? You may have a very good vocabulary if you're medical students, right? You have very like, Latin stem, the health terminology, but that doesn't mean that you're a good communicator, right? So I'm not sure about in Thailand, but in US, when you see a doctor, the patients always ask to fill out some evaluation form, right? This is the same in Thailand too. Yeah. So if doctor is not really supportive, I mean, the patients can feel right away, right? So this communication skill is now getting more and more important, even for the healthcare professionals. So they actually assess interactional competence in their role play. So in certain assessment contexts, assessing IC is a very important. And then we could provide diagnostic information. So I know that now 𝗲𝗂 and other many universities in Thailand, they want to offer like very specific ESP courses for students, right? So English for what, aviation, English for, it's very specific, English for the tour guides, English for something, right? So in many situations, interaction competence is very important. So if they need to work on interaction competence, we have to assess them, right? And then we need to provide some diagnostic informations. So that's why we need to assess interaction competence. Extrapolation, that's related to how well we could link the test performance to their real life performance. So usually in the interaction competence are very important in many contexts. So if we assess interaction competence kind of in real life context, we could better extrapolate their language abilities in the real world context. And it's related to some positive washback, right? So if we assess the interaction competence for like grading purposes, students might prepare for this test, and then they could actually improve their interaction competence. So and it's not easy to assess interaction competence, but it's important. And the next question is how? What task? What rubrics do we use? And then we could use kind of a OPI format, but we know that this has some issues with especially assessing eliciting interaction and roles, because the questions turns are dominated by these interviewers. And then what about the paired and group test, right? Is better format than interview, right? Okay. But then when you have a like pair group task, they have a certain task to work together, right? You can just say, hey, just talk to each other. You cannot do that. So then we have to give a certain task so that could work together. And then that possible task, like this kind of a picture descriptions or story completion task. So if you have a pair task, I mean, you've probably done this in your classroom, maybe for like a intermediate level speaking course. So one student received these 6 pieces of pictures in the correct order, and another students received the picture in kind of random order. And then one student described these 6 pieces of picture in order, and the other students placed these pictures in the correct order, right? So that they have to communicate with each other. So that's one way to assess their like limited aspect international competence, right? So how do we, do clarifications? How do they, resolve the communication breakdown? And then if you have really novice level, you could do more simple tasks like a spot difference task and map task also possible. And then for the little advanced level, you could give this kind of a what you call the consensus task. So they have to agree with each other as a group or pair. So like, hey, you have 5 minutes, but then you have to agree on the 3 things you would bring to in deserted island, right? So you are just like, happen to be in the island where nobody lives, then what would you bring? What would you bring? What would you bring, 𝗧𝗧𝗃, If 3 items you can bring to the island, desert island. Laptop, okay. Two more. You can bring 2 more items. Charger. Charger and cell phone. Okay. Right. So Shada said, yeah, I will bring laptop, charger, smartphone. And would you agree? Phuket Island. Right. And the people say, hey, what we cannot live without food, right? But I mean, then we need some kind of fishing gear, maybe nets and whatever. So you have to agree with each other, right? About 3 things you bring as a group. So then it could actually uh, elicit more interaction among the group members. And then if you teach like some like English for business purposes, then hey, you have to you're the member of the marketing team, and then you have to product new product. It's like could be a smartphone, health product, or whatever, and then come up with a really good marketing plan for this, right? And then they have to communicate with each other. Right. What are the other possible measures of IC? I mean, you could do like this course completion task. You give some task, like you're applying for a new job in a small company. What did you do in these situations? And then this is what we call the written DCT, right? You were given in the prompts, context in written form, and then you kind of write what you would say. But this is not really authentic. We don't really have interaction, right? You could only measure their like understanding of a speech acts. That's pretty much about it. So, but you could still do like multiple choice test if you think that the possible answers like vary too much. There are too much variations, and then you want to assess their understanding of speech acts only, then you could use this kind of multiple choice example. So here, Kevin said, Carol, I really need $500 for rent. I'll pay you back tomorrow. And then you have some the following response and Kevin, 200 is great. Thanks so much, Carol. And then if that's Kevin's response, what will be the answer? And the answer is? What's the answer? C, right? Sorry, I don't have that much right now. How about $200? Right. So this understanding the intended meaning of the item, routine, right? What do you just say in this common context? So nice to meet you. Implicature. Hey, Jenny, it's August. It's cold outside. I mean, no, is it cold this morning? It's August. What's the answer for this? It's a warm like usual in August, right? So this kind of items is tapping into your understanding of idiosyncratic item or implicature. So the meaning was not directly stated. You have to kind of make inference about what does that mean. But to understand what does that mean, you should be in that similar context, right? So people say it's August. That means that, you know, it's like usually it's summer, right? But this response can be interpreted differently in Australia, right? Because August in Australia is a winter, right? Another type of implicature is like formulaic items. They're in New York. Jane said, is rent high? Mike said, of course. The rent is New York is crazily expensive. You have to pay like what? $3,000 for small one studio. US dollar. 3,000, not baht, it's $3,100, $300,000. And then Mike could say like, of course, are you kidding me? You could say like that. But if Mike said, is the Pope Catholic? Then what does that mean? The answer is the B, the rent is high, right? But to answer this item correctly, you have to know who the Pope is. Do you know who Pope is? Is the right head person in the Catholic. And then is the Pope is a Catholic? Of course, you're kidding me, right? So, but if you do not know who Pope is, was a Catholic, then you don't get this item correct. So this very like, context-specific questions. So this is like what I call the formulaic items. So this kind of expressions exists from culture to culture. I think similar formulaic items can be found in Thai too, right? Is there any similar expressions for this like this? Like, is there any way say, of course, instead of saying, of course? Can you think of any good Thai expressions for of course using this idiosyncratic, no, not idiosyncratic, formulaic item? Well, what is it? 응, 응애야? What does it mean? It has some cultural meaning there. Uh, yeah, it's kind of difficult to like as a native speaker to know that, but like, yeah, it's quite difficult for non-native speakers to know all these things. But the problem with all this thing is like, well, you can only indirectly assess their interactional competence, like very limited aspects, right? So if you want to really replicate their real interactional competence, use either role play or this kind of oral to oral DCT. So you get the response orally and visually, and you ask to respond orally. So let's say this is the example here. So take a look at this.
The adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us.
Yeah. So could you understand the questions? Okay, one more time.
The adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us.
So so this is friends, right? So she's Rachel, and then there are two couples were Chancellor and Monica, and then they became a couple, and then they want to adopt the baby, right? But then to do that, they need a letter of recommendation that needs to be sent to the adoption agency. And then they want Rachel to write a letter of recommendation for them, right? If you're Rachel, what would you say? And then you're not going to refuse. You say you're going to do it. How would you say? Then you could, make a pause here or just cut up the rest of the video. And then you have to like what? Just, a couple of seconds to think about it. And yeah. What did you say if you're Rachel? Is it Pope Catholic? Oh my God. Okay, let's see how she responds to their request.
The adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us. Of course, I would be honored.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so she didn't say, is the Pope Catholic? Of course. See that you see also it's important to note that there's intonations, right? You don't say, of course, right? Of course, as you have to notice that's the different intonations, like peach, of course, right? And then I'm honored to do that, right? So that's like following, the expressions. And then look at this is, what's his name? Joy? Joy. Let's see Joy's response too. Let's do it.
The adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us. Of course, I would be honored.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there's been an oversight.
Sure, we would have asked you. We just thought you wouldn't be interested.
Yeah, it's just that we don't think of you as really being so much with the words.
Right. So do you understand the situation? Just one more time here.
The adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us. Of course, I would be honored.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there's been an oversight.
Sure, we would have asked you. We just thought you wouldn't be interested.
Yeah, it's just that we don't think of you as really being so much with the words. The adoption agent. The adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us. Of course, I'd be honored.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So he was like clearing his throat, right? What does that mean? Yeah. So see, this interactional competence includes the understanding of those kind of non-verbal behaviors, right? So if you don't have, is that a problem with the throat? If that's your interpretations, your interactional competence is very low, right?
The adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us. Of course, I'd be honored.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there's been an oversight.
I think he said, I think there's an oversight, right? Oversight means that you ignore me. Hey, so this is like another like idiosyncratic implicature. So, I mean, that's why it's a little difficult for, as a non-native speaker, to understand this kind of a sitcom, because all this kind of a lot of implicature, right? I think, I think there is some oversight, right? You could have said more explicitly, how come you didn't ask me for letter recommendation? I could written a good letter for you too. That's like, there's an oversight, right? There's like longer version of, there's an oversight, right? And then see how they respond to it. So they understand the elocutionary force and there's oversight.
Sure, we would have asked you. We just thought you wouldn't be interested.
Now it's like more explicit, right? Well, we would have asked you, but we thought that you're not interested in, right? So it's more kind of direct, right? But then let's see how Monica said about why they didn't ask him for letter of recommendation.
Yeah, it's just that we don't think of you as really being so much with the words.
Yeah. Can you understand what's said? We don't think you're the much of the, and then she's a little pause, right? With the words. So here the words, it doesn't mean that just words, right? Here with the words, meaning that what? Yeah. So to do so, what do you need? You need a good vocabulary, right? So here with the word means that the implicature of the with the words here that, you lacks vocabulary. So that's why we didn't ask you to level recommend. But it's if you say that directly, it's like too much like face threatening, right? So that's why there's kind of using some idiosyncratic implicature here. So let's watch this one more
The
time.
adoption agency needs letters of recommendation, and we were wondering if you would write one for us. Of course, I'd be honored.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there's been an oversight. Sure, we would have asked you. We just thought you wouldn't be interested.
Yeah, it's just that we don't think of you as really being so much with the words.
Wait, hey.
Clearly, we were wrong.
Look, I got a lot of nice stuff to say about you guys, okay? And I know how much you want to have a baby, and I would love to help you get one.
You know what? Enjoy. We want you to do it.
Thank you. All right, let me see how I'm going to start. Dear baby adoption decider people. So excited about your letter.
What you working on?
So this is like, the implicature is important to understand their intended meaning, elocutionary force, how to take turns, right? It also involves a lot of like paralinguistic features, including, eye contact, gestures, all those things. Okay, so I think I will stop here. It's now 11. We ends at 12:30, right? So it's really good time for a break, and we'll come back like in 11:10. 11:10? Yeah, come back by 11:10. Okay, we're gonna have a break now. Okay, so we so far talked about why we assess interactional competence, and also what are some possible ways to assess interactional competence, including some different versions of discourse completion test, right? But then the discourse completion test does not allow us to capture the whole elements of interactional competence, right? Because interactional competence, like how do we sustain the interactions? So it's difficult for us to assess how they maintain topics, how do they take turns. Those important elements of interaction competence is difficult to be captured if you use only discourse completion task, right? So usually if you're interested in assessing interactional competence, we often use role play. And the role play is really valid indicator of pragmatic knowledge at multiple proficiency levels. It is known as a reliable measurability to use the correct functions, different speech acts like apologies, requests, refusals in Korean and many other second language. And it's also known as an authentic task by listing in session interactional features, English pragmatic performance. So a lot of not just only language assessment, if you want to teach and assess their generic interaction and competence, even in the native language, the role play is a kind of common task we use. So this is kind of example. You could do role play in this is academic context with the professor, or you could also do role play with the classmate too. And then the reason why we have a different role is to know whether they could use language differently depending on the power difference, social closeness, and degree of impositions here. So Yoon, this is her dissertations. She kind of manipulated this relationship between the participants, and then also she has some different level of inquisitions. So see how well the students can interact with the professor and classmate. And then you can see that this example here, role play with the professor, and then this actual exchanges. This is, I think, advanced students here. What can I do for you? And I actually have a little favor for you. I'm applying for this department scholarship. And then I need a letter of recommendations. And I was wondering if you're able to write one for me, right? And you can see that the 𝗧𝗫, who play the role of a student, have some kind of intended pauses, right? And then she says something about why you do need that. She didn't say, I need a letter of recommendation, right? She said, why I need that. And then using the past tense, past progressive tense here to have some more distance from 𝗧𝗫 and the professor. But if you can see here, this is the exchange between the professor and then 𝗧𝗫. You see that this is quite direct. This is the low intermediate level students. Hi, 𝗧𝗫, come on in, have a seat. And then there's this in conversation analysis, this number inside the parentheses indicate the length of pauses, right? So 4.4 seconds. Hello. Can you write the recommendation letter for department's scholarship for me, right? So see that there's some unnatural pauses and then it's a relatively direct request, right? So that indicate that person has some kind of a low interactional competence. And then these are some possible criteria that you could use to assess their interactional competence. This is from the Yoon's dissertation again. So this first three categories more related to within terms. And then including content delivery, language use, sensitive to situations. So the content delivery is about whether that speech itself is clear, fluent. And then the language use is about whether that person using pragmatically appropriate linguistic expressions like biclausal condition, like I was thinking, I don't think I can, using the model verbs. If you do that, they got the highest score 3. Otherwise, they receive either 2 or 1. Sensitive to situations. It's like the students show that the evidence awareness, sensitivity to situations, right? So asking for letter recommendation is a very common request in the academic context. But we know that, you are also ajans, most of them, and we have a very busy schedule, right? So we expect that students, when come to us for letter recommendations, we expect some kind of a level of a politeness, right? So this one is like whether the students who play the role of students aware of these situations. And then between turns, this is more like kind of co-constructed compared to the previous 3 categories. Engaging with interactions. So you have to show that your understanding of previous turns. So this would include like back channeling would be included, this kind of level of engaging with interaction. And then turn organization. It's like whether you just dominate the whole turns or you allow the other partners to speak. Okay, so these are the common 5 criteria we often use to assess interaction and competence. And then let me move on to my current research that published in language testing this year. So we are interested about comparing rating scales for role play as a L2 Chinese pragmatic assessment. So we had 43 English-speaking learners of L2 Chinese from Midwest University in the US, and we used the 5 different scenario role play tasks, listed some refusal speech act in Chinese. And then we have 5 male native speakers, Chinese from northern China, and then they're used as another role player. And then we videotape all this role playing, and we hire the 9 trained Chinese-speaking raters to assess their interactional competence with the focus on their refusal speech acts. So this was one of the situations, one of 5 scenarios we used to assess their L2 Chinese pragmatics with the focus on refusal. So here, the situation is like the Professor Lee's computer is broken and you and your friends spend the entire morning fixing the computer. It's about noon and Professor Lee wants to take you take you both to lunch and the campus cafeteria. And then you have to do refusal. So the professor who played the role of professor said, hey, you guys are awesome. Let's go and have lunch together. It's my treat. Then you're supposed to say no, right? And then the common expected response like, oh, professor, you're too polite to us. You don't really need to do that. It's just only a light effort. Don't worry about it. Then professor should say like, should insist, you shouldn't just stop here. So that's what the role players are trying to do so. No. This really is a big help for me. We're going to have just something simple at the food court. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. But then you still have to keep resisting. I said, oh, I'm so sorry, professor. And you have to come up with some excuses, right? Oh, I have a class at 1 p.m. Let's do next time, something like that. And then they end the conversation. Yeah, okay, next time. Yeah, like that. So then how do we assess their abilities? So there are 2 different rating scale we use. The first one is called the hierarchical binary scale on the 3 rating categories: content delivery, language use, and discourse control. And this example is a focus on the content delivery. So the hierarchical binary scale is also called like kind of performance decision tree. So instead of giving the whole rating rubrics to the raters, we give binary questions one by one. So they ask Is the refusal ultimately successful? And the answer is yes, you move on to the next questions. If it's no, that student received the lowest score, 1, right? So if they cannot make refusal, say, oh yeah, then they got score 1 because they did not do the intended speech check, which is refusal. And if they, at least, perform refusal, they move on to the next questions, and then raters make a decisions whether participants, the refusal come with one or more explanations. The examples we just saw was, we have a class at 1 p.m. That's kind of explanations. They didn't just say, no, 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 no. They said, thank you, but we have a class at 1 p.m. If that's what they did, move on to the next questions. Are the explanations effective? If it's yes, you're going to move on to the final questions. No, they receive score 3. So there's some explanations not really effective, right? You could say like, I have a class at 1 p.m. Oh, but you say, oh, my dog is sick, right? But then that's not really as effective as we have a class at 1 p.m., right? And then the final question is, the speaker offered the explanations without being asked. So they say like, oh, no, no, I can't. I love to, but we have a class at 1 p.m. without being asked, oh, why, right? If they do it in advance, they receive the full score. So this is the way how you use this hierarchical binary scale. But we also try different rating scale, which is very conventional, typical analytic scale on 3 rating categories. And then this is the rating rubrics they receive. So we have a criteria, content delivery, which is aspect. And the score range from 5 to 1. And then we have a descriptor for each score. And then they observe the role playing, and then they give a score according to this descriptor. So we came up with these 2 risk questions. To what extent do different rating types affect that severity, consistency across rater scenarios and criteria? And then the following question 2 was about, so how many raters, how many scenarios would you need to achieve the minimum level of reliability in the role play task? So to address the first research questions, we ran RASH, multifaceted RASH measurement. And have you heard about RASH analysis? So in the forum, the second day, we had presentations about the RASH, and then it's quite obvious that a lot of people got lost because like it's not easy concept to understand, right? So, I mean, we use RASH too, but to help you to understand what RASH can do for us, let me give you some basic information what RASH can do. So here, as you can see here, right, we have learner A and learner B. And then learner B is better in terms of language abilities than learner A, right? And then we can use their raw score, right? But for better comprehensions, we use the Lodge scale, kind of a standardized deviation. You know standard deviation, right? 0 is average, and increase to the positive infinitive, decrease to the positive infinitive, right? So +1, -1, +2, -2. So Lodge scale is very similar to the standard deviations. Its average is 0, and then the higher value you have, the higher learner ability, the more difficult, the more severe if it's a rater. Is the negative value indicate that the lower in terms of language abilities, easier for test difficulty, more lenient is for raters. right? So what RASH can do is we could have all these different facets on the same logic scale. So we could compare the learner's ability levels, rater severity, item difficulty, task difficulty using the one scale, right? So that's kind of beauty of the RASH scale. The reason why we call the multifaceted, because we have a multi-factors, right? We have a learners, raters, items, and task. These are the facets. That's why I call the multifaceted. So we could tell whether which items is more difficult, who's the better learner, which rater is more severe, which task is easier. We could tell all this like difficulty, severity from just one table, right? So that's the beauty of a RASH. So that's why a lot of researchers using RASH to answer that question. So our research question is about, so rating rubrics, right? We use rating rubrics which rating rubrics produce like a better, score distribution among the learners is whether which rating rubrics has a higher rater severity or scenario difficulty. That's the questions we have. Okay, so move on to the next one here. Right, so here we have a different facet summary for HB, stand for hierarchical binary rating scale. And then we have a facet summary for multi-trait rating scale here. So you see that the first table here, the column, we call the measure, right? We see that measure here, and here. This is a logic scale, like a standard deviation. So 0 doesn't mean that your score is a 0. It's average, right? +1, you are like 1 logic above the mean. If someone scored 2, you are 2 logic above the mean, right? The higher, the better. And these 2 students below the mean, average, right? So you can see that whether we use these hierarchical binary rating scale or multi-trait, the typical traditional analytic rubrics, these 2 students receive the lowest, right? It doesn't matter which rubrics that raters use. And then we have some similar level of a score distribution between 2 rating rubrics, right? And then criteria. So as you can see that here, there are more difficulty, the variation difficulty was found when raters use multi-trait rating scale. Why? Because as you can see here, there's a little more gap between discourse and the content, right? But here is more kind of a close together. That means when raters use this binary rating scale, the difficulty of criteria is more homogeneous. There's not much difference, right? So if they receive like, for example, 4 in content, and they're also likely to receive 4 and another 4 languages. But when the raters use multi-trait rating scale, they tend to give a more difficult score for discourse compared to content languages. So if you want to make distinctions between categories, multi-trait rating rubrics is slightly better. And then raters, right? When the raters use this binary rating scale, which rater is the most severe? Rater number 3 is the highest, right? Is the highest logic scale, most severe. Which rater is the most lenient then? Rater number 1. So 1 is the most linear. It's the lowest value. But then that things has a change a little bit when they use different rating rubrics. But the overall rater severity is not that much different. And the next one is scenario. Scenario is about which scenario is the most difficult, right? So whether they use either binary or multi-trait, scenario 4 seems to be most difficult. And then The other scenarios seem to be quite similar to each other. But then scenario 4 is most difficult. And the scenario 4 is actually about interaction between student and a student, not a student with the professor. I mean, you probably understand why, because in the many foreign language teaching context, teachers often teach, how to talk with the, professors and teachers, not much about, student using some informal languages. They tend to teach like formal languages. So that's why I think that students perform better with another type of scenario, which includes teacher to student interaction, not student to student. Anyway, what we can learn from these findings is that, okay, next. So it's related to the research question 2. When we use these multi-trait rating rubrics, we can use smaller number of these scenarios. So what that means here, so you see that this kind of different line here, that means if you have one rater, if you use a one scenario, your reliability as low as 0.29, right? And then if you have one rater, if you use two scenarios, your reliability will be about 0.44. But we know that the minimum level of reliability is the 0.8. So, hey, I want to achieve the minimum level of reliability 0.8. How many raters do I need? How many scenarios do I need? So if you use these binary rating rubrics, you need at least 2 raters and then the 4 scenarios, yeah, to achieve the, no, actually the threshold that we use about 0.75. So if you want to reach above 0.75, we need 2 raters and 4 scenarios. But if you use these multi-trait rating rubrics, you need about 2 raters, but with the 3 scenarios, right? So what we can learn from this, the difference between using either hierarchical binary multi-trait is not that big, but you could ask students to do fewer scenarios if you use the multi-trait rating rubric. So if you have a choices, which type of rating rubric would you use? Multi-trait, right? Because you could achieve the same level of reliability with a smaller number of scenarios, right? So it looks like we still need 2 raters, not a single rater, right? If you use a single rater, if you use the whole 5 scenarios, the highest reliability you could achieve is only like 0.65, right? And then the multi-trait is only what, 0.70 something, right? So you need at least 2 raters, but then you could use a smaller number of scenarios to achieve the minimum level of reliability for the role play task. And then move on to the next question. So what are some outstanding questions still remained in the assessing interaction competence? And then one of the questions that I received in the chat box was that, so maybe understand that assessing teaching interaction competence is important, but why is rarely used in high stake testing? So that's one of the questions raised among in the chat box. Because it's hard to score. Interaction competence is hard to score because we don't really have a clear, transparent norms and benchmarking. The reason is that because we observe even large variability among the native speakers. So 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗃, for example, when she score learners' English conversation expressions, she found that there are a lot of variation even among the native speakers. So she had to use 50% as a cutoff. So what that means, like more than half of native speakers use this convention expression for specific context. She select them as a target conversation expressions. But that means that about, another half use different conversation expressions among the native speakers, right? And then the other researchers like Liu and then the Matsumura to come up with the answer key for Chinese multiple choice discourse completion test request refusal items. They use the 70% native speakers agreement rate, but they indicate it was quite difficult to find those items that whose native speakers agree more than 70%. And then, but the other people say they found some 95% above native speaker performance rate observed. So they actually suggest that we have to look for a higher level of a native speaker agreement to be used for like acceptable responses. An interesting finding was kind of recent finding from the Dye and Rover from the University of Melbourne to 2023 study. Some Chinese native speakers perform worse than non-native speaker Chinese in the L2 Chinese interactional competence test. So that means we cannot rely on native speakers' responses as a gold standard, right? So, I mean, that's kind of another major reasons why the interaction competence is rarely used for high-stake testing purposes, because the any answers can be acceptable, right? Any responses can be acceptable. So, but then how do we kind of minimize acceptable responses? Then there are certain very specific contexts, right? Many native speakers would agree. Many Raver speakers produce similar responses, especially like kind of a doctor to patient kind of a interaction context. So probably we could come up with some very similar I mean, we could come up with some rating rubrics for very specific context, but it's quite difficult and it's almost impossible to assess interaction competence in kind of a very generic context. Okay, and then another issue is about whether we have to give a single score or a joint score, right? So we know that the interaction competence is co-constructed, and if that's the case, can we give an individual score? Or should we just give a joint score? So this is still open-ended questions. And then uniqueness of interaction competence. So the issue is that if interaction competence score is highly correlated with the other, like for example, speaking test score, what's the point of testing interaction competence, right? Can we just use speaking test scores? And that's the really legitimate questions. And many researchers found that there's some positive but moderate correlations between speaking and interaction competence score. Like see the 0.76 is pretty high, right? And if that high, I think that we could use speaking scores to predict their interaction competence score. But some other researchers, like for example, Rover and 𝗂𝗲 found that the total IBT speaking scores interaction competence are low, like as low as 0.57 for low-level students. So if students' speaking test score is kind of a low, then there's a correlation between IC and speaking score is not that high, right? Then, we cannot use speaking score to replace the interaction competence score. And then this is like kind of a most important topic that we'll talk about today here, I guess. So the use of a spoken dialogue system assessing interaction competence. So we know that it's quite logistically challenging to assess IC, right? Can we use like AI, right? And then the Oki and then his students from Iowa State University did a lot of recent research about the use of this spoken dialogue system in assessing interaction and competence in English. So in their study, they had 40 students completed a paired oral task with both human and the computer partner. It called IC Lister, Interaction and Competence Lister. And they assess fluency, pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary. And then they found that these like typical traditional speaking scores score similarly across two conditions, right? So it doesn't matter whether they interact with another human or computer partner, they receive similar scores on this fluency, pronunciation, and grammar vocabulary. But higher IC scores observed with the human partner, but more IC features were generated in more like kind of a standardized manner when they communicate with the computer partner. So that's their findings, but the more details was kind of interesting here. So they tend to score higher on intellectual competence when they interact with the human compared to interact with the computer machine. And then they wanted to focus on assess these 12 features of interaction competence, like how do they check the comprehension? How do they clarify requests? You know, the list is on and on. And then this is how they create the spoken dialogue systems. So they use the ASR, automatic speech recognizer. So you say something, right? And then the machines transform your speech into text. And then the next stage is called the dialogue management systems, using the keyword matching systems. So if you say something like in the keyword, so I say, I disagree with something, then the computer recognize, okay, this person disagree with the specific prompt, and then they come up with some possible responses to those kind of responses. And then they use these natural language processing systems. And then they create text to speech, right? And then they create the audio. It sounds a little robotic, but they create some audio based on these keywords matching programs. So they start with the ASR, ASR stands for automatic speech recognizer, and then they identify keywords from the test taker's responses, and then they transform those responses into speech. So, but some of the concerns of this one, definitely the body language is not considered because, you know, the machine cannot capture the visuals of the speaker. So features based on who are experts in oral ability. So this kind of a interaction of features identified based on the previous research findings. What if the machine cannot identify keywords? Then some kind of very generic phrases were used to listen more speech. So could you tell me, could you elaborate on what you said, or could you tell me more about it? Kind of generic responses were listed. And then this is more details about how they elicit interaction competence. So they, like I said, use ASR, using Google Speech, and then their students' output compared with the keywords matching. And then they use Amazon Polly to convert text to speech. So that's how they use. So they use kind of very, so this research has been done at the school setting. I think that their funding is quite limited. So they're not really able to use some more advanced generated AI programs. So they have to use kind of a Google Speech and Amazon Polly to provide some these dialogue management systems. Right. So they listed some previous research with that. What they found is that human peers adjust each other, but you know, definitely this one cannot. The spoken dialogue system cannot. And then the human raters having a human partner discourse is more, I mean, that's really not surprising, right? But then test takers kind of split on their preference between SDS and human partner. Some students prefer to work with the machine, others prefer with the human partner. Is it surprising? Do you think that students more prefer to work with the human partner? But the thing is, this is a paired speaking test in the high stakes context. So if they didn't like the working with a specific partner, they'll say, oh, it's better to just talk to the machine, right? This person's like doesn't really match my personality. I think the AC is not working, right? It's a little hot here. Yeah. Yeah. So this is what there are more details about this task. So they talked about some academic topic, and then they hear some issues for 45 seconds in audio. And then the position is kind of a retail about the specific topic, either by test taker or spoken dialogue systems. And then they have another 45 seconds audio clip, which has some opposing academic positions. And then you have to retell another position of the same topic, right? And then you have to convince other people for the rest of 4 minutes. So that's your job here. If you talk to computer, you have to convince the computer. That's how you do it. And then there are findings, like there are more rateable IC features identified in the ICE. So here, clarifying request, question for opinions, self-correcting topics, responding to requests, prompting was more elicited when they interact with the computer partner than with the human partner. But this kind of finding is kind of predicted because this computer kind of engineered or programmed to ask these clarifying questions and question more opinions. But for human partner, if they understand their positions, they don't have to, right? So that's why these features are more elicited in when they communicate with the machine, but not with the human partner. And then they identify more rateable features in the human conditions, like the replying in appropriate amount of time. So since they use a little bit some basic AI systems, their reaction time is not really natural. So when they communicate with the human partner, this is more like kind of a easily elicited when they communicate with the human partner. So their finding is like more features rateable in the IC conditions than human partner conditions. So like feature 10, responding to classified requests, just unrateable for almost all test takers human conditions, but rateable for all test takers in IC condition. But this is, I think, the computer is a program to ask for clarification request. So I don't think this is issue whether you work with the machine versus human. If humans are asked to ask clever questions, I don't see there's big difference for this feature. I think that even when you interact with the humans, the same level of these interaction feature was also elicited if their human partner asked to do so. And same for the feature two, clarifying a request, right? So the computer kind of programmed to ask, could you say it again, right? But humans didn't. Because this is not interview. This is like you work with another student, right? So they're not really trained to ask this kind of interactional competence related questions. So the opportunities kind of demonstrate certain ICE features may not emerge human features because they're not trained. They're just students who work in this pair task. So I think if you want to demonstrate IC features, the human partners need to be trained. And if they do that, I mean, they could also elicit similar level of interactional competent features as the ICE did. Self-correcting feature wasn't specifically programmed, but 2 times the test takers were rateable in IC compared with the human partner. So what that means, when students interact with the machine or computer partner, they do more self-correcting than when they're test taker. I think this also is not really surprising findings, because when you work with the program computer, you feel more like you have to correct more, do more self-correction, because we don't receive any kind of a prompt response. Right. Right. So that's what they said, is a perfect speaking partner of the needs for self-correction is emerge. Right. Yeah. So what they said at, yeah, I mean, you could use these kind of interactional competence elicitor, which is the computer partner. But then what they say is that the scores they receive when they work with the human partner IC is not comparable, right? The test takers, when they interact with the human partner, tend to receive a high scores interaction competence. These are not really interchangeable, right? So what they kind of indicate that when no opportunities to show a feature of IC during a test, raters get benefit of the doubt. So when not all interaction of features were elicited when the work with the human partner, right? But so when the human partners did not elicit all the interactional features, raters skip that. Yeah, I mean, this person could do better in the when they're actually asked to do so. So let's give high score. So, right. So avoidance of certain features is less effective when talking to with the computer, because computers kind of programmed to ask specific clarificatory questions. And if they not respond to it, it's quite obvious that they lack such kind of interaction of features. So that's why they score low when they work with the this kind of a computer partner here. Right. So what they argue that, you know, this spoken dialogue system has advantage because it can target specific features of IC. So if you want interested to just assess interactional competence only, they said, you know, the SDS probably better options. But human partners definitely accommodate each other ability, which is what would happen in the real future, right? But then these kind of SDS lacks those kind of flexibility. So that's kind of limitations here. And then so I think my own takeaway from all this, like assessing interactional competence, we have to present the task with the more comprehensive, specific contextual information so we could kind of minimize acceptable responses. And if you have to use this course completion task, use oral to oral, not like a written to oral or multiple choice discourse completion task. And then try to present the task with authentic real life context by incorporating the, you know, real pictures and videos to enhance student engagement. If you use like inauthentic, like outdated information, students can recognize right away and they feel kind of demotivated to do so. And then the coming with the rubrics is a really important, assessing this like pragmatic interaction and competence. Do pilot tests before from both native and non-native speakers, and then identify what are the possible responses. And you can, you know, set the appropriate benchmark, probably 70 or 75% above. If you set the 50%, you kind of too generous about their possible the acceptable responses. And then use these rubrics to establish clear guidelines for evaluating performance in different pragmatic assessments. Then the final point that I want to make about is that, especially if you, not for the really high stake purposes, but kind of a like what is kind of low stakes for diagnostic purposes, you could now use some more advanced spoken dialogue systems like a ChatGPT 4.0. So you could do more natural role-playing context here. So have you ever used ChatGPT 4.0, 4.0 and do some role play? No? Have you? No? Okay. So let's see if we have some real conversation with the. Yeah. Yeah, I think 4.0, you have to pay for the subscriptions, right? Yeah. But I kind of surprised to note that they have really good recognitions. Okay, let's see, have some conversation.
Recognition.
Okay, hello, ChatGPT. How are you?
Hello. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking.
Do you mind doing some role? Okay, I'm fine. Um, um, do you mind doing some role play with me?
Of course, I'd be happy to. What kind of role play do you have in mind?
Okay. Do you want to be a teacher and then who receive requests for letter recommendation, and I'll play role of a student? How does it sound?
That sounds great. Let's get started. Hi, I'm your teacher.
Hello, teacher. How are you? Connection failed. I mean, I tried with this home with a strong internet connection. It went really well, but darn it. Come on. Okay. Let's see. But I mean, yeah, I would just stop here. I mean, I have to reconnect with him. Oh, sorry for ChatGPT 4. Oh my goodness. Yeah. But I noticed that the reaction time was quite, I mean, it's a little bit paused because the connection was not really strong here. I using the data, not the strong Wi-Fi. But I tested at home. The ChatGPT played really well, and he really respond to um, my the response, and then he provide really natural prompt response, and then I also asked for the the feedback, how I can do the better, and then you give really good feedback for that too. So now I think they had to use a little bit basic level of SDS, but if you use this kind of a more high tech SDS to elicit interactional features, I think this kind of machine can easily replace the human partner to assess interaction and competence. So I think that it's quite likely, or we have some kind of a bright future for using machines to assess illicit interaction and competence. So I think it's better to step. Now, I know there's some other stuff that I can talk about, but it's probably better to take some questions from the audience and then have some more Q&A. So for Zoom participants, if you have any kind of questions, please, you could either, I think unmute would be not really easy. You could leave your questions on the chat box, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Okay, I will also take the questions from our live in-person audience as well. But in the meantime, here, I have oh, here, you see the questions? So one question that I received was, can alternative assessment, performance-based assessment, project-based assessment serve as examples of dynamic assessment? If this yes/no questions, I would say yes. It can be used to serve as a dynamic assessment, but to be called a dynamic assessment, we need a room for the individualized or standardized intervention or feedback. So if no such if such elements are missing, I don't think we can call the dynamic assessment. So make sure that we have those interventionistic functions is available in those performance or project-based assessment, and then we estimate their potentials, and also we want to make sure that actual learning occurs as a result of our interventions. So that's the very important in dynamic assessment. And we have two more, no, not a questions. Okay. Oh my goodness. Vina, ask questions in Thai. Oh my goodness. What is it about? Ah, okay, okay. So it's not a real questions. Why is it rare to assess interaction competence? I think I already mentioned this, right? So there are so many possible acceptable responses unless you narrow down the context, and it's quite also expensive. It requires a lot of time and resources to assess interactional competence. Okay, now I'll take any questions from the live in-person audience too. So here's the thing. So what are the current trends, right? So that's the whole topic of my talk this morning. The trends is definitely now we use more and more generative AI, right? As a item generator, and then as a rater, or the conversation partner, right? So that's, I think, the more common trend. So for example, like a test like a Duolingo English test, they use ChatGPT-4, and they did in the past too, for everything from the item generations, passage generation, scoring, score report. But I mean, they also, indicate that we have a human reviewers to monitor whole process. They just truly just only use the generated AI for whole, test administration process. They also have the human, like, what is it, monitors, make sure that everything is ethical and is bias free and appropriate and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of big trends right now in language assessment research and then practices. And also, at the same time, we're trying to kind of enhance authenticity, right? So not just only just grammar tests, vocabulary tests. We want to replicate the real life tasks in the testing context. So as I said, we trying to include more different variety of English as a legitimate listening test input, right? And then we also try to use a lot of unscripted listening tests as input, right? So we want to really try to enhance authenticity of language assessments. So I would say there are the two major trends. We use a more authentic language task, and then we use more generative AI for many different purposes in language assessment. Is it good or bad? It's still open-ended questions. But the think that with all language testers would agree that we can just too much heavily rely on the AI alone, right? We have to make sure that it functions well as we intended. So we have to more closely monitor the AI as a test developer or, marker and everything. Let's see if you have any other questions posted on the chat box here. Yes.
Should I think about the proficiency of my students too? Because usually the spoken responses have to be extended, right? In order for students to show their intellectual competence. So how much we have to pay attention to the proficiency level, way to their, like intermediate users, something like that.
So that's really good point. So to assess interaction and competence, their responses should be extended, right? This is like just one response, then we cannot assess the interaction and competence. So at least like three or more, like, back and forth, right? But if their language proficiency is really low, like A1, something like that, A2 maybe, A1, A2, can we assess the interactional competence? Because their responses will not be really extended. I think my response is still yes. Yes, right? Even we have some 2 turns, right? Or 3 turns max. But you see, when someone asks you, how's you, response? So for example, if you, learn Thai, you said, basic back channeling. You say, if you, say, Thai, and you have to nod, you have to, keep smiling. Those kind of important, like basic elements, interaction and competence in target language can be taught in the day 1, right? And then if there's something that you're concerned about, you need to assess it too. Yeah. Right. Right. So like how to start the topic. I mean, how do we start turn, right? How to say hello. That's, important interactional competence too, right? So yes, it's important. So we have to teach and assess even for the low level of students. And then the research finding also kind of provides some insight into when we start assess teaching interactional competence. They found that there are fairly high correlation between speaking score, interactional competence score among the high level students, like 0.78 above is quite strong, right? But then they found very low correlation among the low level students. That means that they have a different level of different levels found between speaking and then interactional competence. So that's another kind of evidence. We also need to teach interactional competence for low level students. Okay, that's a good question. Thank you for the questions. And I'll scroll down to see if there are any questions. I don't think I have any. Oh, here. Okay, so the question was, if I understand correctly, students L1 plays a role in their L2's IC. My question is, would that be a problem for high-stake tests like TOEFL and corporate IC in the test? Should be used. Okay, so this really could, I mean, that's probably another reason why IC assessment is not widely used in the high-stakes context. Yeah, because like, depending on what language you speak as a first language, it'll definitely affect your performance, interaction, and competence. I mean, the personality as well, actually. And then especially, what about, we teach English as an international language, where then we don't really have a native speaker norm, right? I mean, so Thailand has their own cultural norms and Vietnam has their own cultural norm, then which norm should we use? We don't really have native speakers norm, right? So then we have to be very careful about that. So if that's the case, then we probably need to stick to that some universal interactional competence features. Like, in every kind of cross languages, not a really good idea to overlapping term, dominating terms, right, in conversations. So those kind of a universal interactional competence features can be first assessed and we could focus on. But there's some kind of a variations can be found among interactional competence features across different languages. You may want to avoid if you want to assess interactional competence for high stake purposes. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so I mean, yeah, I don't want to encourage people to join my afternoon session again, but you could, ask the questions later too. So, okay, so I will just stop here and then I will give a floor to 𝗧𝗵𝗺.
The audience, both here and online, for your participation this morning. We are having another talk. This is the last one in the series. It is in the afternoon, starting from 1:30. And this one is implementing the CFR in the English language classrooms. I hope you stay tuned with us. And thank you, Dr. Shin, again, for your insightful talks and exchanging information and ideas with us researchers and teachers and students. Thank you again, and I will see you in the afternoon. Enjoy your lunch break. Thank you. ขอบคุณค่ะ